Thank you all for joining us. My name is Dan Crowley. I'm a partner here at the firm. I work on financial services policy issues, and it's a great pleasure to introduce our panelists and to welcome you to our reception after the panel upstairs on our 9th floor. We hope you'll stick around. We're having a panel today on SEC Staff Legal Bulletin 14M. The panel is entitled, "How did we get here? What does it mean for investors and companies?" And it's really a timely topic given the focus not only regulatorily but legislatively on the proxy voting process, the role of proxy advisory firms, and so forth. We're joined by a really esteemed panel, and I'm going to very quickly introduce them and then turn it over to Bob Eccles, our moderator. First, we have Tim Doyle, who is CEO and president of the Responsible Business Initiative. Tim is a legal policy and public affairs expert with more than 15 years of experience advising Fortune 500 companies and other stakeholders on corporate governance, regulatory compliance, and strategic advocacy. He went to Michigan State University, where he received his BA and his law degree. I first got to know Tim when he was working at the American Center for Capital Formation, and more recently when he was running the ESG program at the Bipartisan Policy Center, and he's become a friend over the years. Matt Thornton is Deputy General Counsel at the Investment Company Institute. He's been at ICI for about 11 years, and he has particular expertise in liquidity, valuation, corporate governance, and proxy voting, advertising, social media, and issues relating to fixed income disclosure and investment advisory matters. Before joining ICI, he was a lawyer at a little-known firm called Deckert. I'm joking, of course, they're probably our best competitor, at least with respect to asset management and investment funds. And before that, he was at SunTrust and Merrill Lynch, and he is a certified financial planner who sorry, I lost my place. Oh, here it is. Got his BA in economics from University of Notre Dame and went to the Georgetown University Law Center. Next, we have Tom Quadman, an old friend. I've known Tom, I think, longer than anybody else on the panel. Tom is Executive Vice President at the U.S. Chamber Center for Capital Markets Competitiveness, as well as the Center Technology Engagement Center and the Global Innovation Policy Center. He has real expertise on corporate governance issues, worked on Dodd-Frank, and was instrumental to passing the Jobs Act, and has established a number of coalitions, including the Corporate Governance Coalition for Investor Value. He went to College of Staten Island and New York Law School. And finally, we have our moderator, Bob Eccles, who currently is a visiting professor at Oxford University. I got to know Bob 20 years ago when I was working at NASDAQ. He was an advisor to our CEO on corporate disclosure issues. He's probably the leading authority on corporate disclosures in the world. I refer to him as the father of the sustainability movement. Around the time we were working together at NASDAQ, he wrote The Value Reporting Revolution with Bob Herz, who went on to become the FASB chairman. He has his own column on Forbes.com and is working on a number of exciting projects, including the Statement of Significant Audiences and Materiality campaign. And he's also working with Tim on the Responsible Business Initiative. He went to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and received his PhD from Harvard University, where he was a tenured professor at the business school for what, Bob, 28 years, something like that? 14? 22. Okay. Anyway, with that, I will shut up. Again, remind everybody at the conclusion of the program, I welcome you to join us upstairs on the 9th floor for refreshments. And with that, I will turn it over to our esteemed moderator, Bob Eccles.
As I said back in the day, a long time ago, sustainability and ESG used to be good things. You know, that's kind of changed. That'll factor into this conversation. As Dan said, we've known each other for 20 years. Tom, I've known for 10 or 11 from the beginning of SASB. Tim, I've known for 5. When we get together for breakfast in DC at the Hay Adams, the company cafeteria, Tom and Tim they're both Republicans, let's be clear, have avocado toast for breakfast. I'm a liberal. I live in Massachusetts. I have like scrambled eggs and bacon. So from my point of view, boys, real men don't have avocado toast for breakfast. You have quiche. You have quiche, spinach quiche. Matt, I've only met, so what did you have for breakfast? Careful.
You know, I'm more of an eggs and bacon guy. I wouldn't read too much into it based on how you set that up.
Okay, so it's like I'm by myself here. Okay, that's right. I'm used to it. Okay, the recording. So 14M. I'm going to give a little bit of history, and Tim is going to give a little bit more. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not an SEC expert, but I've been watching this with some interest and amusement. We had 14L in the previous administration, and I watched people on the right kind of freak out that, okay, now we've got this license to impose a liberal, progressive, woke agenda, on corporate America through 14L. Okay, fine. Then we have a new administration come in and we have 14M. I have to give you guys credit on 14M because not only is the left unhappy about 14M, but there's people on the far right, like the National Public Policy Center, that are also unhappy about 14M. And they both say, you gotta love this, 14M is trying to destroy shareholder democracy in America. So we've got the far end of my crowd and the far end of your crowd that's kind of joined arms against 14M. So I'm thinking, well, we'll see how this sorts out. I was thinking about the alphabet this morning. There's 13 more letters until we get to Z after M. And so let's say the administrations are in office 4 years, 8 years. I ran the numbers. I went to MIT. So we can probably play this out for at least 50 to 100 years. We'll do M, we'll do N, we'll do O, we'll do P, we'll do Q. So you've looked into the history of this. I mean, is that what we're looking at, Tim? We're going to just kind of keep going down the alphabet?
Well, for the foreseeable future, yes.
Okay.
But it's probably good to level set for those, maybe not in this room, but definitely those maybe watching, and for those maybe that would watch it later, is to why we're here, why we're even talking about this thing called 14M and what a staff legal bulletin means. The best way to level set and think about this is with the creation of the SEC back, with the Exchange Act, well, with the 33 Act and 34 Act, it was created to protect investors when they were investing in companies. That's basically what was going on. If you recall, at that time period, that was right after the stock market crash and lots of people lost money. So that was the rationale for getting into this. In 42, the SEC finally came out with a regulation regarding the Exchange Act to kind of to try to figure out how they were going to regulate this law going forward. And so they did that, they passed it. And of course, whenever a regulator passes a law that's monumental or that's kind of life altering in some people's minds, Congress gets upset. So in this particular case, in 43, the Congress had a hearing, and these are not the hearings of today. This was a 3-day hearing. There's no 5-minute rule. Essentially, you had the chair of the SEC, the head of Corp Fin, and the general counsel of the SEC being grilled for 3 straight days about this new regulation that is relevant to what we're talking about and relevant to how the SEC is going to deal with the shareholder proposal process. And I guess a step back further, I thought maybe you would get into this about Bob and I always talk about how a lot of times we'll go up on the Hill, and some, we'll just say staff, but some people on the Hill more broadly, sometimes fundamentally don't understand what shareholders, the role of a shareholder is in conjunction with leadership or a corporation, what the shareholders' rights are and what that means to have that back and forth. That is essentially what we're talking about, is the back and forth between shareholders and issuers, or companies in this particular case. So, and I told Bob I was given 5 minutes to give the background, so we're getting close there. But so it started in 43. Yeah, right. So it started in 43. And if you think about, and this is why it's relevant, if you think about the progression of politics from 1943 to today, it changes with each administration. So you had these rules come out in the 40s. In the 50s, they came out and essentially responded to the rules, and they were very pro-issuer or pro-company. They did not want shareholders to be able to use this new system that was created to push a political or social agenda. This was part of the argument that was happening back in 1943, which I bring up because we're having it 80 years later right now. But so in the 50s, they were there. In the 60s and 70s, we had the civil rights, of course, Vietnam, and environmental issues really started to become more prevalent in society. We were talking about them more and how they were impacting things. And so those issues started to creep into the shareholder proposal process. Shareholders wanted to know how companies were handling these issues. So when that happened, the SEC responded and started to kind of make it more broad so that all these shareholders were coming in. That's followed up by the 80s with the Reagan Revolution and such. And they saw the explosion of proposals from the 70s and decided to shrink it back down or narrow the gap. And that happened in 1982 with the SEC came out with their release that narrowed it. And to skip ahead to not belabor the point, essentially starting in the Clinton administration, every administration since then has tweaked either to the left or to the right how these proposals are handled, and how the SEC is handling when they come in. So how we got to 14M is the reason that they're at M, and this is just in the shareholder proposal process, but the reason that they're M is that they have constantly been flipping this back and forth. So that's kind of the level set as to what it is. And the other thing that I think is worth mentioning when it comes to the staff legal bulletin, which is what we're talking about, is that's different than a regulation or an interpretive release. So think about a staff legal bulletin as just that. It's a staff recommendation or a staff explanation of how they're going to handle certain things. You have a release by the SEC, which think about it as a little bit more, has a little more weight to it. It is required that the commission votes on it to pass it, and companies can rely on it, but it doesn't quite have the legal, the benefit of the last that I want to mention, which is an actual rule or regulation that goes through the APA process of public comment. And so when dealing with 14M and kind of everything that goes around this particular issue, we're dealing with staff legal bulletins, we're dealing with releases from the SEC, and more recently, we're dealing with actual regulations that went through the process. So maybe hopefully that'll.
No, that's helpful. Let me ask you one other thing, because you've read this thing many times. I've tried to read it, and what I know is that it's destroying shareholder democracy according to the left and the right. But then, as I understand it from our conversations, the BRT doesn't think it goes even far enough. Okay, so they want even more. What is the essence of this 14M, the difference between M and L? And then I'm going to get the experts involved here.
Well, M talked about, there were a couple of different factors that it talked about, a couple of different issues that they talked about. In part of the SEC and how they handle shareholder proposals. Through the years, some of it just started out first as just guidance and how what are called no action letters or how the SEC would handle individual requests. Through the year, and I think it was 76 that it first started, but you actually started to get identifiable exclusions. And there's actually 13 of them that can be used for an issuer or a company to look at a proposal and say, that is not economically relevant. That is, for 13 reasons. And so 14M is really talking about, they talk about a couple of different things, but there's two in there particular that it deals with. One is called the ordinary business exclusion, and the other is called the economic relevance exclusion. The ordinary business exclusion is probably the one that gets Bob's camp upset the most. And it's very wonky in the way that it's written, because this is one of the exclusions. So a company can, if they get a proposal and a company looks at it and says, well, you're talking about, or you want me to do something, or you want information on, what it is you want information on is actually part of our ordinary, everyday, day-to-day business. So we're not going to give it to you, because we can't have you shareholders telling us company how to run our day-to-day stuff. So that's the general rule. Over the years, that's just we'll call it step one. Step two is, okay, it's an ordinary business. However, this proposal is dealing with a significant social issue. And so then, so this would be the exception to the exclusion. If it is a significant social issue, and this is where the change recently came in, and has a nexus or a connection to the company, and transcends the day-to-day operations of the company, then that can be, then a company cannot exclude it. So that's an exception to the exclusion. And then lastly, which is kind of a subpart to that, is whether the proposal in its effect, or how it's implemented, deals with the micromanaging of the company. So you can get to the point where, yes, it's a significant social issue, yes, it transcends the day-to-day, and yes, there's a connection to a company, but it's written in a way that's micromanaging how the company's supposed to implement it. It can then be excluded. So I know that's kind of a mouthful, but 14M is focusing really on the nexus, or one of the big issues is, and I would say the biggest, is that nexus and connection, that nexus or connection. Under 14L, under the Biden administration, they did two things. One, they removed that nexus. So they really focused on whether it was a significant social issue, and the nexus wasn't important. And in the process, they also, in practice, I said, and I'm not sure that they actually wrote this, but in practice, not only did they get rid of the nexus, but they assumed if it was a significant social issue that it transcended the day-to-day operation. So that was kind of they just assumed that. So as you would imagine, once that staff legal bulletin came out, the proposals on the environmental side and on the social side just went through the roof. I mean, I think in 2022, they were up at like 50% on the social side, and I think 20% on the environmental side. So 14M, one of the big issues is they focus on that nexus side. So I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I'd love to, really what I want to do is find out what the investor community is thinking and what the issuers community is thinking.
So Matt, how do you guys see this?
Sure, and I should probably say a little bit about who we are at ICI. We're the trade association that represents mutual funds, ETFs, and closed-end funds, and we also represent advisors to collective investment trusts and separate accounts. And so I think one of the things that we always point out is that, it can be a little bit simplistic to frame these as issuers versus investors, because our members are actually both. Registered funds are investors in public companies, and they vote proxies. But at the same time, we're also issuers with our own shareholders and boards, and we conduct our own proxy campaigns, and occasionally shareholder proposals end up on our proxies too. And so we see the issues from both sides, and I think that makes our point of view a little different from those representing, more of a pure issuer perspective or a pure investor group. I'd also say, just by way of a caveat, ICI, our members' views are not uniform. We have about 200 members, and then on these proxy issues, they tend to be contentious, of course. But certainly in our advocacy, we try to, be broadly representative of where our members are and, certainly in forums like this. I think on this, a couple of other things I'd say just at the outset, we do try to take a balanced view on these issues. So for instance, in 2020, we were generally supportive of the SEC rulemaking there, which raised eligibility requirements around ownership and holding periods and raised the resubmission threshold somewhat. We thought that was generally reasonable line drawing. It preserved access to the company proxy for smaller shareholders, while still recognizing the need to try to align the interests of the shareholder proponents and shareholders and companies generally. So we were generally good with that. I think under Gensler, we saw obviously a pretty major shift with SLB 14L, which we've discussed. I think there was a feeling among many of our members that, as Tim pointed out, not only did the numbers go up, but our members felt like the quality declined somewhat. I think there was an uptick in less support for many of those proposals. The word we tended to hear a lot from members was that some of these proposals were micromanaging, and I think that's one of the key themes that runs through SLB 14L and M. We were also against the 2022 proposed amendments, which would have touched on 3 other exclusions and really shrunk those down. In terms of the current 14M, we actually haven't heard a lot from members about this, which I think itself is telling. Again, I feel like many of our members felt like the pendulum swung a little too far to a more permissive direction during the Gensler years. And so I think many of our members are probably not unhappy with the guidance, although again, I would emphasize that we have 200 members, and so that would not be a uniform view. Process-wise, I think it was not at all surprising that, they rescinded the Gensler guidance and sort of swung back to Clayton. I think the timing was a little surprising. I would have expected this to be more fall of this year versus this winter. And we have heard, some concerns from members, one in particular that they felt the timing was rough and maybe was a little unfair in the sense that proponents and companies weren't quite on the same footing. So I think process-wise, we would have preferred something in advance of a proxy season. And I think, again, on process, we don't love the fact that we keep sort of vacillating from administration to administration. I'd like to see something that feels a little more durable and settled.
I was going to say, I think Commissioner Crenshaw, that was one of her big points, was that the timing of it wasn't. And I know that was part of the big discussion when it was first being talked about, is whether they were going to do it or not. And there was a lot of us that didn't think they would for the reasons, that it was in the middle of proxy season, but they did. So,
but it's interesting because the sense I get from you, these things that I read from the far left to the far right around the decline of shareholder democracy, you guys don't seem to be feeling that way about this.
I don't think so. I think our members approach it more as a calibration. I mean, I think on the far end, there's probably some companies that would never like to see a proposal. Others take the view of almost the more the merrier. They wouldn't want any screening mechanism. So I think our view is that there ought to be a reasonable screening mechanism. And so that, proposals that, are put on proxies are serious and do have some connection to the company's purpose and long-term aims.
Tom, what do you think, man?
Oh, I think a lot of things, though.
Are you one of these guys that think it hasn't gone far enough?
No, look, no, well, let me,
loaded question.
yeah, no, let me put it this way, right? I spoke before.
Candid, and I'll buy you breakfast.
Buy you a drink. No, I spoke before a group of state pension administrators in 2009. It was myself and it was somebody from a labor union, and we were having a little bit of a debate about the UN principles on responsible investing, which, by the way, does not use the word profit. And why is that important? Because if you take a look at our securities laws and our corporate laws, they're all geared towards return. And the point I made there was, if we started to go down the road that we were going down, and if you looked at the political divisions that existed then, which are pretty, we're in a much different world than we were in 2009, abortion was going to become a shareholder proposal issue, and everybody started laughing. Where's abortion now in terms of shareholder proposal issues? It's up there, isn't it? Right? I don't care where you are on that. So 14L suddenly comes along and says, you know what? Issues of great societal impact, yeah, we're going to let them go through, which is really interesting because if you look at the Clayton time at the SEC, what Chairman Clayton was trying to do at the time with proxy advisory firm reform, with threshold, resubmission threshold and the like, he's actually trying to get the SEC out of the business of trying to be the umpire around shareholder proposals. So now you suddenly swing, I would actually argue, swing as far as you possibly can. And we sent a letter to the SEC pretty shortly after 14L went into place and said, you've now made the SEC a political arbiter. And guess what? What you may think is a issue of great societal importance is going to be different in the next Republican administration. So you want to talk about ping pongs? That's like taking a baseball bat to our capital markets. So I would actually argue 14M is actually sort of reverting back to the norm that we've had. So I would look at it a little differently. We actually went pretty far off course for a period of time. And what you're now seeing, and what I would argue is different, when we've been talking about special interest activists using the shareholder proposal process, we're not just talking about one political party or one set of activists, because you now have activists on both sides. So if you now have activists on the right and the left coming out of business, what is the board of directors supposed to do? So I would actually argue we need to get back to what the fiduciary duties are, why investors are going in to companies, not for political agendas, but to get the return that they need for whatever they're investing for.
I was just going to make one comment on that, Tom. It's funny, as I mentioned earlier, that was the exact argument that was made back in 1943 and has been made at every swing to the left or to the right. That they sat there, and again, as I think I mentioned, that for 3 days they kind of grilled the SEC about the rule, saying this is going to be used by activists to push a political or their agenda in one way. And the SEC, very interesting back then, is like, no, that won't happen. And if it does, though, we'll respond and we'll do that. But so here we're 80 years later, still going through the motions.
So I wasn't here in 1943, but it was just a few years later I showed up. So I wasn't there to watch the hearings. What did the word activist mean in 1943? I mean, this is long before ESG, sustainability, all this stuff. Like when they talked about activism, what did it even mean in 1943?
Well, I mean, based on just the transcripts that are from the hearing, they were talking both activists that had some kind of agenda that wasn't necessarily based in it wasn't like a hedge fund where we want a company to do something because we believe that that's going to be the increased returns for the shareholder. No, they really thought they were like activists that would get in there, kind of some crazies, and come in and have these ideas about what a company should do, completely divorced from the company. But they were being given this opportunity to kind of see to come in and kind of make their political argument. And the number of the opposition, we'll just say the Republicans on the committee, responded and said, this is a horrible idea and it's going to get out of control. And the interesting thing, though, is as it's gotten out of control, one way it kind of flips back. And I think that's Tom's point, was that the 14M is kind of bringing us back to we'll call it the compromised middle a little bit. And I think with some people, and we're going to get to it in a second, is some people are concerned that there might be a push to go further to the right than 14M did, and that will be interesting to see.
So let's talk about Republicans for just a second here. So I admit a lot of the ESG shareholder proposals came from my guys from the left. I'll also say that a lot of these were sort of values-based, trying to be masked as value-based, so I get that. And then the right goes, well, here we have these shareholder proposals where people are trying to pursue a political agenda, and interfering in the capital markets, and we don't think that's a good thing. And I basically agree with that. So what do you guys do? So we got a great idea. We're going to file anti-ESG shareholder proposals. Exactly the same notion, right? Trying to use the shareholder proposal process and interfering in the capital markets to pursue a different political agenda. So is this something that just gets baked into the way politics work in America?
Time will tell, right? Because look, I would go back to the old Michael Jordan line, Republicans buy sneakers too, right? There's a reason why he sort of stayed out of politics.
Yep.
And time will tell, because I think there at least was a notion in the late 2010s, and maybe it's still there, maybe it's not. We'll see, where there's a notion it started on the left, but I think it also then flipped over to the right pretty quickly of, maybe we should, use the shareholder proposal process. If we can't make progress in Washington, D.C. or state capitals, let's, use the shareholder proposal process to sort of push things forward. And our viewpoint has always been, look, that right or left, that's not the way this should be working, right? Because the shareholder proposal process and director challenges and the like, that really is an important marketplace mechanism for shareholders to be able to tell directors, and then consequently also send the message to management of, you're not organized properly, you're not looking at things properly, you're not looking at market signals. And if you're throwing all this other noise into the system, you're really subverting what it should be used for.
I mean, it's interesting because I think it's part of this, at least for me, this broad narrative that's been going on for some time, which I think is problematic, that the public sector is failing, the private sector has got to pick it up and do more. And so they'll use things like shareholder process and disclosures and things to try and address issues that in a lot of ways I think should be addressed through public policy. But then you say, well, okay, if this should be done through public policy, it should be done through legislation. You've got a polarized country, you've got a Congress that basically seems to be supine. So I don't see how you get sort of resolution there. Let me ask you kind of a nit here, which isn't any of the notes, so this is out of the blue. So this will be okay. So when I read this stuff, activist investors, I'm thinking it's curious how that term is being used, because I kind of think of activist investors as hedge funds. And not only am I friends with Republicans, but I'm friends with people in hedge funds. I like hedge funds, right? My daughter works in a hedge fund. I love my daughter, but she does fixed income. She doesn't do shareholder proposals. So the activist investors, because the complaint about them is that they're really not interested in value creation. They're looking to go in, make a quick buck, change some things around, sell off some stuff, change the balance sheet, blah, 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 get rid of a bunch of jobs. And then they take a lot of money and run. They buy a place in the Hamptons and everybody else is screwed, right? If you're an activist investor, you're indifferent between 14L and 14M. I mean, I don't even see them being mentioned in this debate. It's all about the ESG stuff. Like, if you're an activist investor, how are you feeling about 14M? Indifferent, or you kind of like it?
Look, we use the term special interest activists, right? Which I would distinguish the two, because if you're an activist investor and you're doing some of the things that you're talking about, Bob, you're trying to presumably look at the fundamentals of a business, trying to, determine if the business is run well or not, and then, taking actions based off of that. If you're a special interest activist, I would argue you're there trying to push an agenda that's separate from what the business is all about. So we always try and distinguish the two, because if you really notice, other than some work we've done around years ago on short and distort campaigns, really, if there are those type of activist campaigns that you're talking about, that I would say with special interests, we're talking about a horse of a completely different color.
Matt, what's your take?
I think terminology is important. I think our members you hear our members call it either, active or index or passive. I think the one thing those groups both have in common is they're generally investing for investment exposure, and, are doing so in a sense passively, in the sense of not trying to get board seats, not really, directly compelling some action on the part of, the company. So I think the posture of your typical, mutual fund or ETF manager is different from the activist investor who's clearly a 13D filer and clearly, is buying maybe 5%. Again, trying to really push management and the board in some firm direction. So I think those lines have maybe gotten a little blurred, but that's the distinction that we would tend to make. And I think again, whether a fund is active or index, they tend to be passive in the sense that they're not doing those things and generally not putting forward shareholder proposals. I think a few of our members do. They tend to be very explicit, sort of sustainable funds, and not, again, your run-of-the-mill complexes.
I was going to say, it's probably worth mentioning too, that a lot of engagement happens outside of the proposal process. Like that's the last straw, if you will. I mean, most investors will go and try to sit down with the management of the company, and even on the hedge fund side, and try to figure things out beforehand. So, yeah, I don't. It's a great question. I guess I haven't seen very many of the proposals from them.
So
they might not care.
they may not care. Tom, when you're talking about, in a way, and you were talking about it too, Tim, kind of go back to what Clayton was doing, sort of more middle of the road. Are there any really substantive differences between kind of what life looked like under Clayton and what's in 14M? Or is it basically just, no, we're kind of just going back to life before 14L?
Well, I mean, I think that the one thing that probably sticks out has to do with the board input under Clayton. They wanted more board input, and I think, and then the Biden administration came in and took that back. And 14M doesn't really put it back. It essentially says, hey, if you want to use it, you can, but we're not going to require it, or we're not going to look differently. So I feel like that'd be one issue that's different from the Clayton side.
What do you mean board input? You don't have to do it.
So under Clayton, they wanted a board analysis of shareholder proposals. So they wanted more input. It was strongly suggested, I think, is the language that they use. But that takes a lot of time and takes a lot of effort to bring it in front of the board and actually substantively go through them. And if you're, for instance, a company like Amazon, and I love this, but last year wasn't that bad, but I think the year before they had something like 25 proposals. And it's like, does the board really have time to sit through and go through 25 proposals? And so anyway, so I think that's why in 14M, the staff under acting chair at the time, Mark Ueda, I think that's why they said, hey, we're not going to put this back the way that it was before Gensler. But you certainly can, but we're not going to favorably. At least that's my impression. I don't know, Matt, if you think differently on that.
Yeah, and I think that's right. There may have been some nuanced differences, but I think, in the main, when it came to the two main exclusions, we largely got back to where we were under Clayton. And I think they very expressly said, hey, we are going back to those older SLBs and pulled those back wholesale. So I suspect there are some nuanced differences like the board point, but I think by and large, yeah, we're back.
Would you agree with that, Tom?
I would. I'd go in a little bit of a different direction in that. Look, I think I have an idea, but we'll see what happens. What are the other reforms that the Atkins Commission is going to look at? The other thing I would say though is, remember what I said earlier of Clayton was actually trying to look at maybe getting out of the whole business altogether. And there is a school of thought among some of maybe that's what the SEC should be doing. Now, I would also argue what is a little different now than, let's say, 6 years ago. Delaware isn't what it used to be, huh? Right? You've got more business corporate activity in Nevada. You've got Texas being very aggressive as well. So if you were to try and cede, if the SEC was to try to cede some authorities back to the states or allow state incorporation law to be more operative in that state, well, that landscape is changing too. So I think, we'll probably know shortly, but I think there are other components that, let's say, we weren't thinking about not too long ago.
So what would the world look like? Help me understand this. When you say, if the SEC gets out of this altogether, like what does that mean and what does the world look like? And how are shareholder proposals filed and do they go on the proxy or not? Like, how does that work with the SEC out of the
I
picture?
think that it would go back to the state law in which they're incorporated, which is, that's where this all started to
Yep.
begin with.
Yep.
I mean, the SEC, before it was, the whole purpose of the SEC was that it wasn't working and there were various, different states handled a different way. And we talk about those types of issues all the time. But yeah, I mean, I think that would be what it would look like. I don't know if that's where we'll end up, but there certainly are some people talking.
Yeah,
talking
people are
about
talking about it. I don't know if it's going to be that way or what, but I mean, there's some discussions along those lines.
Yeah, and just talk to somebody at the SEC that's worked on shareholder proposals, the amount of time and effort that goes into reviewing and then producing the no action letter, which essentially means that we're not going to enforce a suit. And there's a lot of effort, and I think that Clayton, I think they even started to do that where they were not handling no act. They really were
Yeah,
pushing.
Bill Hinman was pushing it internally.
Yeah.
At that time.
So the question is, does that happen at a
So
higher
if you
level?
took it to the state level, I mean, like for Delaware right now, let's say the SEC just washes their hands of this whole thing, which would be disappointing because then we can't do another one of these webinars 4 years from now. And I'm having a great time. I enjoy it. Thank you.
I'll have something else to complain about.
No, yes,
Well,
exactly. What are we
Well,
going to do?
statutorily, they can't completely
What are we
wash their
gonna do?
hands.
What are we going to do? So how would this work under Delaware?
Question.
That's a very good question. One of the issues too about Texas is, Delaware obviously has a very robust legal system, right? Has a very robust set of legal precedents. That is hard to replicate, right? And I think that's one of the things that's going on. So I think we're in a little bit of uncharted territory if we were to go down that road. But I would also argue this, and I think this is something that the SEC has to, think about as well, which is one of the things I think we also had in our letter on 14L. Remember, the SEC's tripart mission is it's not only investor protection, but it's competition and capital formation, right? And when you take a look at the public capital markets, U.S. has 42% thereabout of the global share. That is a crown jewel of the American economy. And for all that we talk about maybe inefficiencies and, we don't have the IPOs that we used to have in a number of public companies, that is still separates the American economy out from elsewhere. So we have to be very careful, I think, and this is why I think 14L is such a stark departure of preserving that for our competitiveness.
But if you went down the state route, let me be a little paranoid, if you don't mind for now in a Trump administration as a liberal. I'm paranoid all the time. Could you imagine to say, listen, if you incorporate in Texas, there's no shareholder proposals. I guess you could do that, right? By law? If you incorporate in Texas, there's no shareholder proposals.
Well, it would depend on.
Investors could decide whether they like that or not.
But I think Texas would even have to make they would also have to look at it too, of you want to make sure if you want to have that franchise or be a competitor of that franchise, you also have to make it attractive for investors, right? In order to do that too. And that's what I think too, we have to remember just what the whole shareholder proposal process is about, because what is also interesting about, 1943 and the like is when you start to look at the history of, let's say, shareholder proposal thresholds and director, like those were used very, very rarely, right? So like when you had the 1955 New York Railroad Challenge, that was like a shot out of the blue. But then you go about 18 years past that and suddenly you're dealing with, what was it, Dow Chemical or DuPont and the Vietnam War, right? So, that generation change was what I think supercharged it. But when they were arguing it in 43 and even after that, it was just more of a theoretical argument.
So let me ask you guys this. We've got a few minutes to try and land the plane. So you talked about their staff legal bulletins and, you know, you can just have staff go write those and they publish them and that's fun and entertaining for the staff. And then you have an interpretive release and I guess that's got a little bit more juice in it, right? And then there's
Voted on.
rulemaking and that's hard and that's voted on, right? And then there's rulemaking and you go through this whole process. So to each of you, can you imagine now that there's an opportunity, you know, with this 14M, that we can kind of get enough of a bipartisan consensus to kind of basically nail it down and we don't have a 14N? Or do you think it's just like we got to go through all the letters of the alphabet and 100 years from now, you know, we'll just all be so exhausted, whatever Z is like the last one in place? What do you think?
I think it would depend on what you're talking about. Are you talking about a legislative fix? Because that's a whole.
You tell me, man.
Yeah, I think that would be for those of us that are advocates for certainty and long-term, you know, looking at the long view, that certainly would be preferable. And that would require compromise. Even under the current administration to get through the Senate, you would have to do it. Do I think it's going to happen? Well, that's a whole different story. On the regulatory side, you know, there'll certainly be a vote. I don't know. There'll be certain issues that the Atkins SEC will have to deal with, especially if they go through a full rulemaking and they'll get public comment and they'll have to analyze those comments categorically and respond to those. So there should be, if Paul Atkinson, I think that he will, if he goes back to, we'll call it regular order, then I think that there will be some kind of compromise in a proposed rule of a reform in this area and a final rule. So in that sense that, yeah, I think that there will be some compromise. The staff legal bulletin, I don't know if they'll need another one. It just, they probably won't, at least not on this particular issue. Unless for some reason Paul Atkins staff disagrees or doesn't like it, which I don't think is the case.
Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I think maybe if there's a benefit to the staff guidance, it's fast. You know, and if you have a strong view and you're the chairman, you know, you can enact that pretty quickly, but it's not durable. You know, again, we've seen, you know, this back and forth. You know, so I think our preference would be if we could nail down something reasonable. Obviously, Congress has the authority, you know, whether they could actually do it remains to be seen. The SEC through rulemaking could do something like what you suggest, which is codify, you know, essentially what 14M is, do it through notice and comment, you know, at least give all parties the chance to have their say and influence it. And to my knowledge, I don't think the 2020 shareholder proposal amendments have been challenged. So those have stood. And I think in part it's because they were pretty moderate. You know, I don't think they went too far. And I think, you know, whether you loved them or not, they weren't seen as something that was going to fundamentally choke off the process. So, yeah, I think it would be a good thing, you know, assuming Congress doesn't act, for the SEC to act in a thoughtful way through notice and comment so we can get something a little closer to stability.
Look, I think, Bob, if we were to have bipartisan consensus and agreement that, you know, this is where we should be, and like, that'd be great. That the optimist to me is fantastic. I will say, though, when my colleagues and I get together and we're talking about different issues and regulations, this ping pong we're talking about, it's throughout the regulatory state. And let's remember, too, the concept of an independent agency is just about dead and will be dead soon. So I think you also, you know, so unfortunately, I think we are entering a period just overall where we're going to start to see these swings. We're not going to necessarily see what we used to have of regulatory stability from administration to administration, right? You get some changes here, different priorities, because we, you know, so I think we're in a new world that unfortunately throughout the regulatory state, it's just a different way of doing things.
I mean, that's kind of haunting to me when you say that the notion of an independent agency is dead.
Well, we filed an amicus brief in the Wilcox versus NLRB case, which is one of those cases that's working its way up that could be overturn Humphrey's executor, which would do that. And if you take a look in our brief, there's 2 pages on independent agency, and then the rest of the brief is the Federal Open Market Committee is a non-executive function. And there's a footnote of FASB is a non-executive function, and FINRA is a non-executive function, and NASDAQ is a non-executive function. Each of those have some form of power that you could think is a regulatory power, but they're all awfully important to the system, right, to work. So we're looking at it very much of how do you also draw the lines around that, because of you don't want to have those swings in accounting standards or whatever it's going to be, or setting interest rates, right?
Well, I mean, whatever your politics are, I mean, what's clear when I talk to people in the corporate community, investment community, as you're alluding to, Tom, is like, you never get exactly perfectly what you want, but you just don't want to have these swings.
Right.
But we're in a world now, because of the things you're talking about, because I'm an optimist and I don't think, Trump is going to win a 3rd term. So there will be a Democrat as president again someday, sooner rather than later. But I don't want to see a swing back to, 14-0 thing either. So would rulemaking, if you go through rulemaking, is that enough? Does that stabilize it?
I mean, I think historically the answer would be yes, because undoing a rulemaking was just as difficult, and sometimes, and it's designed through the APA to be more difficult. You have to show a reason that it didn't work. That was kind of thrown out, that long-standing principle of kind of regulatory certainty. I hate to say it, but the last administration did that. Now I know that's being challenged, and I think at some point courts are going to have to determine this, we'll call it the staying power, or how they're going to interpret regulation. But the purpose of regulation is that that businesses and others can rely on it, that it doesn't swing back and forth. Staff legal bulletin, which we talked about today, there's no question that will change. But as Matt, I think, rightly pointed out, it's designed that way. It's supposed to be able to, you're supposed to be able to change with administrations and different agendas. That's how it's designed. I'm the most concerned with what appears to be a disregard of what I would say is the Administrative Procedures Act and the regulatory certainty. That's, to me, where it is. My preference, of course, is legislation. I don't know that we're going to get there. People tell me I'm crazy, but I'm an optimist. So I feel like we can get your team on at some point.
I mean, you are crazy, but that's kind of a separate issue from the discussion here, Tim. So what does a legislative solution look like? It's a law that says what?
We would need another event to do that, I think. I mean, you would, I think you would have to open up, probably the 34 Act, and you'd have to do it. And a lot of people probably just don't want to do that. That when you substantively go and reopen a law that's been around for years and years and years, it can change, and not only it can have unintended consequences. So that would be some way to do it. But I think you could be more prescriptive in focusing on some of these things that flip back and forth. You could try to legislatively codify some of the long-standing rules and rules and the way the agencies worked on stuff. That I think could be done, and actually you would probably get some bipartisan support, if we get to that point. But Matt, I don't know what you're.
Go ahead, Matt. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, at the far end, it could be, abolish the rule, and, the SEC could never do something in its place. Or it's legislation that kind of makes its peace with the general structure and maybe, tries to codify some exclusions in certain ways that people can live with, or ownership or holding period. So I think there are things that Congress could do that sort of recognize the rule and its structure and only seek to maybe, firm up certain parts. So I think Congress could do anything. I think maybe it's a more pragmatic question of, where could we get some consensus to do something that gives stability?
I would take it a little differently. If it's in effect and it's in operation for a period of time and the marketplace is okay with it and uses it well, if there's a recognition of both sides, maybe things went too far, that might be enough, right? And I'll make the argument of we didn't have to go through a whole climate disclosure rulemaking because we had the 2010 guidance, which, by the way, right, the majority of public companies working with their investor base figured out what was material and disclosed it. And that actually, so even if, the Gensler climate rule goes away, which I think it will, you've got the 2010 guidance, right, which has worked for 15 years. And I think that's the same thing here of if there's a consensus that, yeah, we shouldn't politicize things. And if it's an operation, the marketplace is working, that's the way it should work.
So, kind of at the end, and we're going to get free booze from K&L Gates. Let me ask you guys one last question and any closing thoughts. So we're going to have a new chair and we're focused here in this discussion on 14M. Like what's the relative importance of this issue for what you think the SEC as a whole is looking at over the next 4 years? What's your take on that?
I would say there's probably three main issues that they're going to work on. I think 14AA, what this falls under, is one of them. I think the proxy advisor reform is probably another one, which of course is a separate issue and also talked about in the BRT paper, I might add. And then of course, digital assets and crypto, that I think is going to be the other, which is totally separate from this, but it's also one of their, I think those are probably the big three things. So, yeah, and I think they'll get to all of them, but that's my thought.
Matt, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that list sounds about right. I think there may also be a push to try to expand access to private investments. But I think you will also see a push to try to make it, try to ease some of the burdens to be a public company. So it wouldn't surprise me if they do both. And I think, some of these issues like 14A8 could be packaged as a way of making it a little easier to be a public company.
So Tom, I'm going to give you the last word, then we're going to go upstairs and have some white wine and avocado toast and a quiche.
Okay.
And as we go with that.
I'm going to be real short then.
Okay,
All right?
man.
I agree with everything that they say in terms of priorities. The other thing I would say, thing I would throw out there that Congress is sort of kicking over to the SEC is folding the PCAOB into the SEC,
Oh, yeah.
which is going to change audit regulation.
That's a huge deal. Yeah. All right, guys. Thanks. Dan?
So we're not going to end. We're just going to reconvene on the 9th floor. So we can go up in groups and Lauren and Malia can help people get up in the elevator. I want to thank our panel. I think it would be difficult to put together a more esteemed group of experts on this issue. So thank you, gentlemen, very much.